Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started on Chapter 1 here. Chapter 1 is it's mostly a basic introduction. These are the things common to life. Most of this should already be pretty familiar to you, and consequently, it's not that long of a chapter, so we'll go ahead and get started there. So, characteristics of life. It exists almost everywhere on Earth, great variety and diversity in forms of life, and they have certain common characteristics that makes them living. So they are organized, they acquire energy and materials, they reproduce, they respond to stimuli, they maintain homeostasis, they grow and adapt, or they grow and develop and have the capacity to adapt. They're organized. Organisms are organized in a hierarchy of levels. So first and foremost, you have atoms, which first and foremost you have atoms, so basic elemental building blocks of things. Just look at a periodic table to see a list of them. This isn't a chemistry course, so don't worry too much about it. Then you have molecules, which are combinations of different types of atoms, and then when you get to the cell, you have the basic unit of life, which is the smallest thing that is capable of being alive is a cell. You take a bunch of similar cells and put them together, and you get a tissue which performs a particular function. You take different types of tissues, put them together, and you get an organ, and then you get organ systems to produce, or then you take a bunch of organs, put them together, and then it produces an organ system. And then typically a large macro organism has multiple organ systems that work together to produce a overall functioning organism. Materials are needed to maintain organizational hierarchy and carry on life's activities. You can't grow cells without the basic building blocks necessary to assemble them in the first place. You also have to have energy to do that. And energy is the capacity to do work. And I understand that there's a very specific definition of work in physics, but we're not worried about that right now. Just think generically, like if I'm moving around doing something that requires energy to do it. We'll worry more about types of energy in Chapter 6. Organisms have to reproduce. Life comes from life, biogenesis. Though depending on which school of thought you ascribe to, at least one time life came from non-living things, but that is again a whole other bag of cats. Reproduction is the process by which an organism makes more of itself, which you do on a generational level. One organism making another copy of itself, mother to daughter, that kind of thing. And on a cellular level, we're constantly reproducing and replicating the cells in our body to replace those that have been worn out from damage or to grow. DNA directs the cellular functions and is duplicated prior to the organism reproducing, because if you end up with a cell that does not have a functional copy of the DNA in it, it's not going to do much of anything. It's just wasted materials. And then genes are units of information within an individual's DNA. Organisms respond to stimuli. Stimuli is just anything in the environment that they can react to. They respond to external stimuli, usually by moving toward or away from it, which is referred to as taxis. They use a variety of mechanisms to move in response to the stimulus. Some things walk, some things fly, some swim. Some, if you're just a little amoeba, you roll your cytoplasm kind of like a tank's tread towards whatever you want to get to. Some use flagella. Some microorganisms just kind of tumble out of the way. The movement of an organism constitutes a larger part of its behavior. Typically, you move away from something that would harm you. You move towards something you want, like food or a mating opportunity. Seek pleasure, avoid pain, kind of, basic operating system. Organisms must maintain homeostasis, which is a relatively constant internal environment. Homeostasis means remaining the same, staying the same. Uh, that does not mean it's always constant per se. For instance, your body temperature fluctuates throughout the day, but that means you do everything you can to counteract that change in order to stay as constant as possible. Organisms grow and develop, so you can grow and increase the size or the number of cells, and development takes place, is the changes that take place between conception and death. Think about a caterpillar molting and becoming a butterfly. That is a form of development. Organisms have the capacity to adapt, and when they say adapt here, they're meaning kind of more along the lines of evolution. It's been roughly 4 billion years that we're aware of that life has been on Earth, and some individuals are better in a new environment and some less so, and so that natural variation between them leads to organisms that are better suited tend to produce more offspring, and that leads to a variation of alleles over time, which this process is referred to as natural selection, aka survival of the fittest. And a common misconception that people tend to think about this is that being fit means, bigger, faster, smarter, stronger. From a evolutionary standpoint, when we're talking about natural selection, fit means most able to produce offspring. So whoever leaves behind the most copies of their DNA is the most fit, which results in time this process repeated again and again over time results in the change of the frequency of the traits in the population and species, which is referred to as evolution, and can result in speciation, meaning that a single species becomes multiple. Organisms are classified based on their similarities. Systematics is the discipline of identifying and classifying organisms. Each organism is classified in a domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. If you have difficulty remembering that, just think of, did King Philip come over for good soup? And this is from the list, and this order is from the most inclusive to least inclusive. So domain, big bucket category that a lot of things fall into, and then species is very specific. There's only one thing that fits in a particular species category. Domains is the largest classification category, and organisms are assigned from 1 to 3 groups based on biochemical and genetic evidence. So archaea and bacteria include unicellular prokaryotic cells that lack a true nucleus, and then the domain eukarya is eukaryotic cells that include a true nucleus and have genes found in the DNA within the nucleus. Archaea tend to live in extreme environments, too little oxygen, too salty, too hot, or acidic for most other things. The name archaea means the first ones. They tend to be relatively simplistic and have the capacity to survive in these extreme environments, which are more similar to earlier conditions on Earth, which supports the hypothesis that they existed before the other domains. Bacteria are found pretty much everywhere on Earth. For every 1 cell in your body that was coded for by your DNA, there's 10 that are bacteria. I mean, they're literally just everywhere. Some bacteria cause diseases. Many are beneficial, but the majority of them are neutral. Like they don't really do anything for us, or they don't really harm us. They're just kind of there. Eukaryotes are further divided into 4 kingdoms. You have Protista, fungi, plantae, and animalia. The names are fairly self-explanatory, but the Protista is the only kind of weird one, which is there are unicellular and multicellular protists, and it's kind of a catch-all bucket. We don't really know what to do with something, so we just stick it there, and there's a lot of arguments about how to further subdivide Protista, but that's a little beyond the scope of our class at the moment. Fungi, molds, or molds and mushrooms, fungus. Uh, Plantae, multicellular photosynthesizers. Some are decomposers, but photosynthesis is generally their shtick. And then Animalia, multicellular organisms that ingest food. The taxonomy is the assignment of a binomial to each species. Binomial means, two names. So you have the genus name and the species name. Genus is capitalized, species is lowercase. Both words are italicized. For example, Homo sapiens, Canis familiaris, or Felis domesticus. Organization of the biosphere. The biosphere is the zone of air, land, and water at the surface of the earth where living organisms are found. The population is all members of a species within a particular area, and then a community is all the different populations in the same place. The ecosystem is the community interactions with themselves and the physical environment. And the characteristics of this would be like chemical cycling, moving chemicals from one species to another, energy flow. Energy comes, ultimately all energy on this planet comes from the sun. And so it flows from the sun through plants down into the food chain, or more accurately, the food web. Ecosystems, climate, largely depends on where ecosystems are found around the globe. The most biologically diverse ecosystems occur where solar energy is most abundant, which kind of makes sense if everything ultimately requires the sun for energy and you can't do anything without energy. Then where you've got the most sun, you have the most energy to do things. So this is typically like tropical rainforests and coral reefs. We are a little bit unique in the sense that we modify domains. We're a little bit unique in that we tend to modify ecosystems for our own purposes, which you have to be very careful with, because if you modify something too much, you can destroy it. The process of science. Biology is the study of life. Biologists and all scientists generally test hypotheses using the scientific method, which is detailed in your textbook, but is summarized in this figure over here. You observe something, you come up with a hypothesis about what could have produced that observation in the form of a question or testable statement. You test it, you make a conclusion based on that, you alter the hypothesis based on your conclusions, test it again and again and again until you come up with a theory. And a theory is, after many experiments and observations, and is supported by a large body of data, then you have the best explanation you can get at the moment. So the theory of gravity, for instance. So when you say theory in a scientific context, what you were talking about is the best guess we have. As far as we can tell, this is correct, but that doesn't mean it is the end-all be-all, because there's always more to learn. But it is far stronger than people just casually say, oh, that's just your theory. That's what they mean in that context is something more akin to a hypothesis. So to do a study, a controlled study, the experiment has to have two groups, the control group and the experimental group. The control group is not treated, the experimental group receives the treatment. The independent variable is the experimental variable, which is a factor of the experiment being tested, and the dependent variable is the response variable, or the result that changes, the result or change that occurs due to the experimental variable which you measure. So experimental background. We know nitrogen is required for plants. We also know that continued use of fertilizer can cause pollution and alter soil properties, which leads to reduced crop yields. So how do you solve this? Leave the land unplanted for several years. Can a farmer afford to do this? Not really. They would go out of business long before then. Or you plant peas or beans, which have conformed these mycorrhizal nodules with their roots and allow the bacteria to convert nitrogen to a usable form. This is called nitrogen fixation. So you rotate the crops and you get higher yields in a sustainable manner. So experiment. Develop a hypothesis. Pigeon pea/winter wheat rotations will cause winter wheat production to increase as well as or better than the use of nitrogen fertilizer. Can you test this hypothesis? Is it measurable? Yes. Prediction. The wheat production biomass following the growth of the pigeon peas will surpass the wheat production biomass following nitrogen fertilizer treatment. So you have the beginnings of an experiment here. So for your control, no fertilizer or legume pre-planting, which the pigeon peas are your legumes. Then you have your experimental groups. You have winter wheat soil treated with nitrogen fertilizer, winter wheat soil treated with winter wheat in soil treated with nitrogen fertilizer. They have 2 of those. Pigeon pea plants tilled into soil and then winter wheat planted. All their conditions remain the same. Oh, okay, so the difference here is that it is the amount of nitrogen fertilizer used. So based on the data collected, the hypothesis was supported. At the end of 2 years, the yield of winter wheat following a pigeon pea winter wheat rotation was better than the other types of plots. This concludes chapter 1. I would advise you go ahead and move on to chapter 2, and I will see you in class next time.